So today I'm going to talk about valuing a 17th century English Bible. Now, one of the most common calls I get is, I have an old Bible, how much is it worth? Now, I hate to disappoint people, but a lot of old Bibles are not worth a lot of money. They were treasured and preserved, and a lot of them survive. And if you've ever seen Tatum and Ryan O'Neill in Paper Moon, you know they went knocking door to door and how many Bibles they sold. But when it comes to a 17th century Bible, that's a different story. They could be worth some money. They could be worth a significant sum of money, depending upon its completeness and other factors and its exact edition. There are some very famous Bibles that are worth a lot of money. For instance, there is the 1631 Wicked Bible. It's called the Wicked Bible because in Exodus and the Ten Commandments, one of the compositors made an error. And he accidentally wrote, "Thou shalt commit adultery" instead of "Thou shalt not commit adultery." So if you've gone down that path and you don't want to consider yourself sinful, I suggest you run out and get the Wicked Bible. You'll have to shell out a lot of money for it. It's often very expensive and a very collectible Bible. This is not a 1631 Wicked Bible. Generally, 17th century English Bibles fall into two categories. One is the Geneva version of the Bible, and the other is the King James. The Geneva version of the Bible was printed first in 1560, and that was the great Bible of the English Protestants. It was the Bible of William Shakespeare, it was the Bible of John Bunyan, of Oliver Cromwell, and it was the Bible brought on the Mayflower to America because it was very popular with the English dissenters. It was really the first mechanically produced Bible for the masses, and it flooded England. And one of the characteristics of the Geneva translations is that it is enriched along the sides with notes, remarks, footnotes, explanations. It really was a study text of the English Bible. And when you see a Geneva version, you can see many of those footnotes along the sides and bottoms of the margins. Then King James came along, and he hated the Geneva version. And specifically, he hated those annotations which he felt were subversive to royal authority. So I'm sure he didn't speak with a Brooklyn accent, but he said those annotations, forget about it. And he convened the famous Hampton Court Conferences in 1604, and out of that they decided that they would create a new translation of the English Bible. And finally in 1611 that was completed, and they printed the King James Bible, which became the single most important and influential book in the English language. The King James Bible, even though it was royally sanctioned, did not entirely kill off the Geneva versions, which were still quite popular. And they continued to be printed even until the 1640s. Sometimes they were surreptitiously printed. They were printed abroad in Amsterdam, then smuggled back into England. And they were even fictitiously dated on the title page, 1599 instead of 1620s or 1630s. So it looked like they were produced before the King James Version was officially sanctioned. This is an interesting version of the Bible. This is a King James Version printed in 1649. And when I think of 1649, I immediately think of the year of the regicide, the execution of Charles I. So this is a Bible printed in one of the most momentous and important years in English history in 1649. Now, there is a standard work to study or to look at English Bibles. It's by Herbert. It's a historical catalog of English Bibles from, I think, 1520s, 1529 on. And one of the remarks he makes about this particular Bible is how closely, even though it is a King James Bible, it copies the Geneva version. If you compare, for instance, this 1649 title page of the Bible with one printed in 1599, you'll see the title page, the woodcut, is almost exactly the same. So immediately when you open it, you think you're holding in your hands a Geneva version and not the King James version. Similarly, it contains a lot of the Geneva Notes, which is very unusual for a Bible of the period, but it did occur. Usually the Geneva Notes died out as the decades passed, and by 1660 or so, after the restoration of Charles II, the King James Version really became the preeminent and single most important translation of the English Bible, and you don't see those Geneva Notes anymore. So this is sort of like a transitional Bible. It is the King James Version of the Bible, but they've included the Geneva Notes on the side, and you can see lots of footnotes and everything in the Bible. So an interesting transitional Bible during the year of the execution of Charles I. Now, in terms of value of a Bible like this, again, I immediately start to inspect it physically. First of all, it's in a very attractive 17th century binding. There is a lot of gilt work on the binding. It's very attractive. You can sometimes look at different gilt tooling on particular bindings and discover, famous bookbinders that have done the tooling. But in this case, this is just an attractive 17th century gilt-tooled binding, as far as I could tell with some research into it. It has, at some point, been rebacked. You can see some slight differences in the leather on the binding, so it has had some restoration, and that, of course, affects the value of a binding. Another nice feature in this particular edition is what I call red ruling, where they've painstakingly gone over every single page with very clear red lines to divide the columns, the headers, as well as the annotations of the Bible. You don't see red ruling in all copies. Usually it indicates a nice copy with wide margins. It was an extra thing, like detailing on a Ford Mustang to get that. And that, of course, added to the cost, and it might have been for a wealthier family who purchased it. So that is a nice thing to have, a red-ruled Bible. Then, of course, there is some provenance on the Bible, some previous ownership, and it's always important to investigate any previous ownership. This particular Bible was owned by a woman, and I always love it these days when there's a woman's provenance on a book. It's very interesting to me. It's also become very collectible as people start to investigate women's ownership and reading habits in previous centuries. This Bible is inscribed by Sarah Weld. It says her book in 1663, and it has some hearts upside down. Those are hearts. Don't mistake them for anything else on a Holy Bible, please. Then there is some additional genealogical information here that it belonged to somebody's mother, was passed down through the family. I do like what somebody has written about caring for books, and it says, "And I charge to make good in reading of it and be very careful of it. It hath been kept carefully for those many years, and I would have it to be continued, to be kept in the family of the Welds." So I do like that there is a little provision here for respecting an old book. It's always nice to have that. It's quite charming in an old book. So I've checked the auction records on this book. Now you have to be careful to, first of all, make sure the book is complete, because Bibles are notoriously incomplete. I have collated this Bible. I've checked the page count through WorldCat and some other sites that I've mentioned previously, like the English Short Title Catalog. And it is complete. It does have the Old Testament title page, does have the New Testament title page. Sometimes those are missing. So that is a big plus in terms of its value. Additionally, you want to make sure you have the exact edition when you go on a site like Rare Book Hub and look at auction records. There are so many English Bibles. So you want to make sure that the edition you are looking at is exactly the one described in the auction records, because there can be a large range of values based on the precise edition. As I said before, if you had a 1631 Wicked Bible, it's worth a small fortune. So do check that out very carefully. This particular version, as I said, seems to appear infrequently in the auction records and infrequently in commerce. It is, again, a King James version, and interestingly, with the Geneva Notes in it, which I think tells a story of the transition in the translation and the readership of Bibles of the period. So I like any Bibles where you can tell a story about them. And I would value a very attractive, complete edition of this one at about $3,000. Now, I will even be taking this one to the New York Antiquarian Book Fair. So if you're planning to be in New York, come on March 7th. We're in 2020, so if you're watching this video in like 10 years, it's long sold, so forget about it. But March 7th, 2020 at the Armory in New York. Definitely check out. It's a wonderful fair. Many dealers from all over the world, and I would be happy to meet you. Besides that, of course, subscribe, and I look forward to making more videos with discussions about the joys of old and rare books.